welcome to Varn, and today we're doing an arts episode, and we're here with my friend Miller. Miller is the director of first year writing at Eugene Lang College at the New School, and the author of two collections, this one, Impossible Things, which we're going to talk about today, and another one, the Unstill Ones poems, which I believe came out from Princeton University Press, right? Am I right about that? And just a disclosure, Miller and I went to school together. We both went. One of Miller's degrees is shared with me. So we know each other pretty well a long time ago. Welcome, Miller. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Yes, we went to school together like 40,000 years ago, I think.
Yeah. During the heady days of the Bush administration. So yeah. This is your second collection, and it's a little different than your first one in that this one feels, I mean, it's about a sustained personal topic. It's, I would characterize it as a book-length double elegy, which is an interesting thing to talk about because it's you processing your grief for your father through the grief your father had for a stillborn or died very young son, I guess.
Yep. Yeah, he died in a drowning accident, my brother, when he was 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
So where did this, I mean, I was about to say, where did this come from? In this book, that's actually an easy answer. But how is the process of writing this book different from your first book, which I think is, not to say that it's less personal, but it is not tied up in like a singular event in the same way.
Yeah. It's funny. I think the processes are more alike in some ways than not, which maybe is surprising. My first book, you're absolutely right. It's like definitely less personal or less like biographical, probably is what I would say. And it is comprised of about a third Old English translations. And so I was getting my PhD. I was studying Old English poetry, and I found that really the skills that I learned as a translator and the cool stuff that I learned about the kind of like childhood of our contemporary English language was like really influencing and affecting my language and my own poems. And so that book is kind of creates a mashup between those two things. My second book, which we're talking about today, in some ways the process was similar, which was that I worked with an exterior text. In the first book, that text was Old English poems. In this book, the exterior text that I was working with was a memoir that my father was working on before he died, which he didn't finish and which is unpublished. And I sort of, I mean, it was a more personal journey for sure. I really started, well, first I'll just say, I don't remember a time as a child that I didn't know that I had a sibling who had died pretty tragically and mysteriously. And I knew this, but it wasn't until I became a parent when my first child was born in 2016 that I realized how much that had affected me. And it moved from something that I thought about very much in a child way, where like this is something that happened to my parent, right? That like sort of has nothing to do with me, which is obviously not true. But that was how I thought of it. And then when I had my first child, I realized that very, very quickly that I had been parented by someone traumatized by the loss of a child. And that was a huge part of what fatherhood was for me. And I was like quite panicked and anxious, and in a way that is like somewhat unusual. And then kind of realized where it was coming from, remembered that my father had been working on this memoir, which luckily my mother had saved like the single copy of. Um, and so I really started from there. It was like one of those things where I was like, "Oh, I finally really want to have a conversation with my father about this and his experiences as an adult." But he had died in 2006, and so I couldn't talk to him. And so I went, like writers and scholars do, I went to the text. And so I started with reading his book. And then that began a process which changed a lot as it went on. But it began a process of sort of like being in a conversation poetically with his text.
I mean, I did find it interesting how long it took you to approach this topic, because we mentioned that we knew each other a long time ago. I knew you when your father died.
Yeah.
And I vaguely remembered it, and I was like, oh, when I got this book, I was like, I remember the instantiating event that you're talking about kind of happening. And I don't know if we ever talked about it, but I gathered at the time that we were in a motherfucking attitude together, or an MFA. That part of it was like, yeah, I remember a couple poems that were about this kind of grief, but in general, you didn't approach it. You didn't approach the death of your father directly at all. Um, and having recently lost both my parents, I have actually discovered that it is really hard to write about, and not sound like a loon who's just writing your therapy papers. And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with writing your therapy papers, but I don't know that I can turn them into viable poetry easily. Um, and so, did you find that having the intermediary text, even though it's about, like, in some ways, an inherited primary trauma, gave you a kind of distance to approach this, or or was it just time?
I think a combination of those things, um, like first off, I'll say, like, I'm a person that, like, if we are get into an argument over a beer about something that I like, if I'm being honest, I'll be like, Derick, actually, I can't talk about this right now, but give me 5 years to stew. And then I'll express like something that makes sense. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm really slow. And I think a professor that we shared, named Alice Fryman, used to read this quote to her students, a Rilke quote. She would read this long Rilke quote, which you probably remember, Derick. It's from the Journal of My Other Self.
Mm.
And it's from the first section of that book. And Rilke basically says, like, you have to go through all of these experiences in your life. And not just that you have to have the experiences, but then you have to forget that you had them until they're like the blood within you. And then you might be able to write the first line of a poem. So there's a poem in this collection, Impossible Things, that I think where the title comes from. And that I think is probably the single poem in the collection that, like, if it wasn't there, I couldn't have written the book at all.
Mm.
That is a poem about my brother's shoes. And when one thing I should say is that my brother, whose name was Joshua, was my father's child from his first marriage and not my mother's child. And so he was my half brother. And when he died, my father's wife's family, this was in 1972, they swooped into the house, and my father's first wife was 6 months pregnant with their second child when this happened. And the family swooped in, and whether this was like their own thing or the prevailing idea of what to do in 1972, I don't know, but they got rid of every single thing that had belonged to this toddler, and like swept the house clean of him like he had never existed. And I think to them, like, it was a path towards healing, probably. But my father, who was in a total daze, like years later, was on the phone with his father and was saying to him, I'm so devastated that I don't have anything of Joshua's. And his father said, oh, I stole a pair of his shoes before they emptied the house. Would you like one? And so he gave my father this single literal, ked.
Mhm.
And my father put it in his closet with his shoes. And so I grew up, like, every time I would see in his closet, there would be this little kid's shoe in with his shoes. And I was just hyper aware of this. And like, if something like that, if growing up with that kind of like symbolism doesn't turn you into an artist, I don't know what will. Like, it may just be that that single shoe like set me on my path towards being a poet. I don't know. Um, but I knew from the time I was in high school and I first started writing poems that I had to write a poem about this shoe. And I wrote a poem. I tried to do it in high school. I tried to do it in college. I tried to do it so many times, and these poems were so bad. Um,
Mhm.
and I didn't know why, but I couldn't write anything about it that was good. It was too sentimental. It was too close. It was too this or too that, or I wasn't connected to it in the right way. And it wasn't until like so many years had passed and I was a parent, I think was a really important part of it. Being a parent myself, um, I think was a really crucial inroads to understanding enough a fraction of what my father would have experienced. Um, and so like that distance was really, really important. Um, and And I think also, the other thing that I did in that poem in the book is I used a form. And so I also found form really, really helpful in its kind of magic of distraction, I want to say. Um, yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question at all, but
You kind of have. I am. I am forced to think about my own process when we talk about this because our processes are very different. But
yeah.
similarly, I wrote a book which you actually even read like in graduate school, and called Sometimes Gray Bodies, which is now a book, my first collection of poems called Apocalyptics. And similar to you, um, I mean, not everyone has this like weird experience, but I literally went out to the desert in Egypt when my ex-wife was diagnosed with uh, stage 4 cancer, and rewrote the entire book, like throughout 50 poems. It felt like, I know there probably wasn't even 50 poems in the book, but it felt like I threw out 50 poems. I rewrote poems that had been stayed for a decade. And it was weird because it was a process that another event caused me to have both the insight and the distance to go back and approach things that were really about my childhood and about the late 90s, and completely rewrite them. And I also thought of Alice Fryman, because Alice would be like, you don't know when this stuff with will happen to you and how it'll change your work, and how like you might have a draft that you felt comfortable with, or drafts that you couldn't, like I can't tell you how many, actually also about my father, how many shitty poems I've written and destroyed about my dad.
Yeah.
And the process of that is actually fascinating, both like as an artistic project and as a psychological one. And you know how uncomfortable I am with psychological stuff in poetry. We used to talk about it all the time. So I also found that form helped. I mean, both obvious forms like sonnets, and I mean, I didn't know I was going to be writing fucking sonnets. I would, if you told me that in 2005, I would have like laughed at you.
Yeah.
Um, so what kind of forms did I read this book and I was like kind of fascinated with its formalism, both like the range of forms in this book, kind of interesting. So how did that additional layer really help you create?
Yeah. The poem that I was just talking about, Joshua Was Gone, as well as another poem in the book and a couple of poems in my first book too, are using a form that I am like just endlessly obsessed with, and soon so shall you be, called the Beautiful Outlaw,
Mm,
which is a New Lepian form or a New Lepian form, that I learned from the poet Darcy Denigan, who, Derick, I don't know if you know Darcy's work, but I
I
think you
don't.
would probably like it.
Okay.
Very experimental yet soulful. Um, and I want to say kind of like vegetal it also in some way. She's a great poet, but she taught me this form. Um, and essentially it's called the Beautiful Outlaw or the Belle Absente, if you prefer it in French. And you take a word or a phrase. This poem is called Joshua Was Gone. And you take a word or a phrase, and then it's kind of like a reverse acrostic. So I used the word Joshua for this poem, so it has as many stanzas as our letters in the word Joshua. The first stanza uses every letter of the alphabet except for J. The second stanza uses every letter of the alphabet except for O. The third stanza, every letter except for S, and so forth. And so within your poem, you can never use the word or phrase that is your key, because there's always a letter that you can't use. And so it literally forces you not to name the thing that you're writing about. So it's truly a way of writing about absence,
Mhm.
through absence. But because it forces you to use all of those other letters, it makes you, as Harriet Mullen says, sleep with the dictionary. And so because you're using like far more Z's and X's and Q's and J's and all of these letters than you usually would, so it causes you to use words and that are surprising to you that you wouldn't, because you have to. Um, so like my notebooks will often be full of lists and lists and lists of words that have these letters in them, for when I need them. And then the other thing that it causes, because there's letters that you're disallowed from, is that you go to use a word or a phrase and you can't. And so that causes you to either say something in a very unusual way, or it causes you to do other things like cut words, have gaps, right? Have like moments of like things just being fucked up. Or sometimes I've seen people use this form and just not use letters. So like they'll just cut the letter from the word. And instead of being bird, it will be BRD or whatever. Um, but so like in this poem, there's a lot of moments um, where you'll notice it now that I told you. But for example, there's a line in that's almost at the very end, and the line is, "I must cry out my upness."
Mhm.
Um, this poem tells the story of my brother's shoe, and it also tells the story of, we all think everything in our childhoods is like normal while you're in the middle of it, and then you grow up and you're like, oh, I was locked in my room from the outside beginning when I was 2 because my father's child wandered out of the house. Um, I should have just put a whole content warning like 20 minutes ago. But, my brother wandered out of the house with all of the doors and windows locked, and was terrified of water, like hated a bath, and wound up in the bottom of the neighbor's pool, and no one knows how it happened. Um, and this was the like central mystery in some ways of my childhood. But so when I was 2, my father put a like hook and eye lock on the outside of my door. And so when I woke up in the morning, I would have to call out and get somebody to come get me. And but I couldn't use the letter A in this stanza. So I couldn't say the thing that is what I used to say as a child, which is, I'm awake, somebody come get me, I'm awake. And I couldn't say awake because I couldn't use A. um, And so I came up with I must cry out my upness, which is so much more arresting, I think, and unusual, and totally gets the idea across in a fresher way than I would have arrived at if I could have used all of the letters. And so it's an excellent form for writing about loss and grief. And I think, you know, this like gets towards something that I think we're both sort of dancing around a little bit, Derick, which is like, I think we share somewhat of a distaste for people using poetry,
Mhm.
either as a stand-in for religion or as a stand-in for therapy or romance or any of these things. Like I almost feel um, we have also both probably read a good amount of Boober.
Yep.
I'm gonna guess. So like I don't I don't objectify my own poems. I don't want to objectify a poem any more than I want to objectify another human being. And I don't use poems as a site for healing, although sometimes they do feel healing. But to me, that's a side effect. And in fact, I recently joked with a old friend from my undergraduate days, another poet, that I go to therapy to write poems, not the other way around.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
And like
Um,
I was like, yeah. So I just think like to use form can be profoundly helpful and not objectifying or like overdoing it in these ways. And I think particularly in this book where I'm writing about profoundly painful, like subject material and grief and the death of a child and of a parent, like it's not hard to be over the top.
yeah, I remember, and again, the spirit of Alice Fryman is gonna like flow a lot through this discussion, I think. But
Yeah.
I remember Alice wrote a book when her mother died, and I think I heard her read from it, and this must have been like 2003. It was a long time ago. But I remember the way she talked about forms and drafting almost as a way of estranging the event from yourself. So instead of like it being a therapeutic answer, it's actually a way to like remove it from you and put it out in the world as a separate thing from your own experience, your own psychology, etc., and not to substitute it. Because the one thing I was just really impressed with, with Alice's poems, as elegiac as they were, they didn't feel confessional. I just remember talking to both her and another teacher of ours, Laura Newburn, about like reading the 50s confessional female poets and like then reading the letters and just those letters feeling ominous because they're objectifying themselves. And I was like, it felt to me like when I read the letters of Anne Sexton, like this woman's literally like putting herself out to die on the page. And while I love the work of Anne Sexton, I was like, I don't ever want to do that. That seems like I don't see the purpose of objectifying, because in some sense, I'm not just objectifying the poem, I'm objectifying myself. Um, uh, and the idea of form as a way to estrange yourself from that, um, I think I kind of learned from Alice and a little bit Laura Newburn too. And um, I definitely was thinking about that reading these books. I mean, one of the things when you read a book from someone that you were working with in an early part of their artistic process and know personally, you're like, oh, this is fascinating where this has gone over 20 years. Like, um, and I want to talk a little bit about this process. I mean, your first book took a long time to get out. And actually, I remember talking to you about this. Our cohort of poets basically all had their first books hit around a decade and change from when we finished our MFA, which to the average person sounds like forever. But I think for us is if I published my like the original book that I wrote when I was in the MFA, like right out of school, it probably would have been shit. And I don't think all those poems were bad. I mean, but it's just I wouldn't have had the experience to reconceptualize them and move myself away from them enough that I can make a call and like, well, this one doesn't belong here, or I should go further with this metaphor because this is too precious to me personally or whatever. Um, but I do sometimes find that there is something like when people talk about the second album problem, there's like a second collection problem where you know your first collection you've been ruminating on probably for and indirectly for a decade, and then you know directly for like 5 years, and then your second book usually comes out a little easier. You're not usually waiting as long. Um, I don't think and I mean this as a compliment. It didn't seem like you had this problem here, so I wanted to ask you about like when did you start setting down to write these poems? Did they kind of bubble up over the corresponding prior decade, or where was this like an active, because this is such a an integrated collection? Did you like sit down and just write it all straight? How did this happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, in a way, weirdly, my second book is my third book because, like you, I had a collection I was working on when we were getting our MFAs. My first collection was called Useful, and which you probably remember.
I do.
And weirdly, like my two published collections, that collection had about a third of it was these persona poems in the voice of my grandfather, sort of a character based on my grandfather. And it's just like, it's actually funny because I have a thing that I need to do where I like am in conversation with something or someone else in my work. And I just can't be alone or something. But that collection very nearly was published. It was a finalist for the National Poetry Series 2 years in a row, and a couple of other things too. And it just didn't get taken. And at a certain point, I was just like, you know what? Fuck this. I'm ready. I'm fine. I don't need this. And like you, I now kind of look back and think, there were some really good poems in there that I would stand by. And I'm glad it wasn't published as my first book. At the time, I felt very resentful because I saw lots of books coming out that I was like, okay, I think my book is better than that book. Right. And I probably still think that. But at the same time, I'm really, really glad that I kind of got time to have a more mature voice by the time the Unstill Ones came out, which was in 2017. And so I would say around, um, as finishing a book and that book coming out, like there's a year or
Yep.
more in
More.
between things, more. Princeton was actually pretty quick. Duke was really fast. They moved up my pub date actually. Like I think, and I'm happy to talk about that process too. But mainly I'll say I started working on Impossible Things after my first child was born in 2016. Um, and Rosie was born in December 2016. So really beginning of 2017, I started working on this book, which was a little before my first book came out. And I was like, staying up all night, taking care of a baby, finishing my dissertation, and like realizing that I was just like utterly freaked out in a way that I couldn't understand, and just writing about it. And also I think, anyone who has kids, this, like it brings up all of your own childhood shit. Like they should just hand you a therapist when you have a baby. Like honestly, it's like unacceptable for people to parent without therapy, in my opinion. There's just no one that healthy. And because you don't know the stuff that's going to come up. And like through parenting about your own childhood. And so, it came quicker than the last one. It did come easier, but weirdly, you know, still not that fast. Like I worked on it from 2017 to 2023.
Mhm.
Um, which is like a chunk of years more than what a lot of people take. And I do work slow, and I also have little kids, so like it's hard for me to find time to work. But I knew a year in what the shape of the book was going to be and what I was doing, and got a lot of really bad feedback telling me that I shouldn't do that, and that like poets don't do project books, basically. That like the way to write a book of poems is to like write poems until you have 42 good ones or whatever. Like, and that's just not how I work best. So, and like the other thing I'll just say is that even though in some ways I worked on this book for 6 years, and that's really clear, I also have a few poems in the book that I have been trying to write since I was like 15. And like in the context of this work, finally, those poems worked. And the one, the beautiful outlaw that I was just talking about, Joshua Was Gone, was a poem that I had drafts of, essentially a similar poem since I was 15. And then another poem in the book called Theory, which is about an incident, a like fairly severe incident of bullying that I experienced when I was 10. Like I wrote the first draft of that poem my first semester of undergraduate when I was 18. And then tried to write it multiple other times, like for like the following years. And it just never worked. And it was too like, oh crap, my fire. Hold on 1 second.
All right.
Great.
So I became aware of this book when a kind of bizarre synchronicity happened, and I'm not a kind of woo-woo person, but I saw a poem. I don't remember if it was in this collection or not, published in Poetry Magazine, with a poem by Darius Ottifat. Now, for those who don't know us, Darius Ottifat is the son of one of my teachers. I believe you also worked with Susan. Susan Ottifat. You did not work with Susan. So Susan Ottifat, or Susan Ottifat Peckham, depending on when you find her work. And it was kind of strange to see Darius's work with your work, considering that Susan was kind of a ghost in our program. I had worked with her, but most of the people in our program did not. She died in Jordan in a bus accident with one of her two children, leaving Joel Peckham, her husband, and Darius behind. And what was it like to be published in like a weird, like I have to admit, it must have been weird when you saw that on the back of Poetry Magazine.
It was, yeah. I never had the privilege of taking class with Susan, but I came to Georgia College to work with her. And so I had come to check out the school, and I'll just make a little like aside here for anyone like watching or listening who's considering going to an MFA program. I went to Sarah Lawrence as an undergraduate and had a lot of worked with a lot of great poets, and who are also fairly famous poets like Marie Howe, who just won a Pulitzer, and the poet Thomas Lux. Jean Valentine was there. Like, and I was applying to MFA programs, and my father was sick, and so I wanted to move back. I was briefly living on the West Coast in the Bay Area, and I wanted to move back east. And I was like looking at MFA programs, and people around me were like, "Oh, you should apply to Iowa. You should apply to whatever, Houston. You should apply to NYU." And I was like, I don't want to be in any of those places. And I realized that I didn't want to go into debt for an MFA, which I don't recommend. And B, that at a lot of those places, they're very not competitive to get into, although they are, but competitive within the creative workshopping environment. Students are competing to impress someone famous. There's not enough to go around. And I realized that I was more interested in attending a small program with a lot less of those kinds of like hierarchies to think about. And so I started looking just for little programs where I could afford to live and where I could get funding with a couple of poets whose work I liked. And so I really researched that, and I discovered Georgia College, and I discovered Susan Atifat Peckham, and read her work, and like read people writing about her teaching. And I just thought, this would be a really great spot. And so I went to Georgia from California, and I met her. I met a few other people in the program. I actually think I met Alice that day. And she was just wonderful, and I couldn't wait to study with her. And I met, I think, all of their family. And so I, applied and was accepted at Georgia College, and then showed up there to find out that, and she was on a Fulbright in Jordan. It was devastating, like, to find out that she had died. And it was so just like utterly tragic. And I think it's funny that you just said she was a ghost over the program, because I really feel like in some ways my book is like about being haunted. And like, yeah, I really felt like this was an absence that was felt. And I had met Darius when he was like, I mean, not a toddler, but like barely, like a really small
5
kid.
or 6.
Really little. And so I had a poem in poetry that is in this collection, and I picked up the magazine and I'm looking at it, and I think his poem was like the page after mine.
Yep. They were back to back too. It was
back to back. I saw his name and I was just like, oh my God. Like, it was incredible. I cried. I didn't know he was writing poetry. And he's a wonderful poet. And then
he's quite good.
He's wonderful. And I emailed him, I wrote him, and just congratulated him. And but I was really, I know, getting published in poetry is like awesome and a great accomplishment, and everyone feels that way. And, you get it in the mail and you see who else you're with, and it's like, oh my God, I'm in the same magazine with Jericho Brown or whatever, incredible. But I've never been like more moved to appear in a journal with anyone, I think, ever than when I saw Darius's poem.
Yeah, it was something else. So when this collection came out, I was like, oh, I gotta check it out. Also would have checked it out anyway, but
I appreciate it.
But it is interesting. One of the things I find about your work is that some of the formal constraints aside, like the Joshua poem we discussed, I could tell. I actually didn't know what form it was, but I was like, this is estranged by some analogous form that I don't know. But your work is recognizable over a long period, but it has matured, and it's actually hard for me to put a finger on exactly how. Like I remember you mentioned your first book, Useful. I remember the Myron poems, which are about your grandfather. Like I specifically remember them. I remember them. Some of them stand out in my head like now, and it's over 20 years since I've seen them. And reading these, it did feel like an evolution of a similar process, but one that had a lot more inputs going into it, both in your personal life, but also like aesthetically. one of the things, I mean, because he's explicitly mentioned, but Paul Celan is like another haunting presence in this book. How did that happen? And has that changed? Has the influence of poets like Celan changed the way you write?
It's a really good question. You know, it's rare that I experience like a one-to-one influence of that kind. There's one poem in my first book that like is so specifically influenced to me. That poem is a pseudo translation, like sort of an after of an old English poem called Wolf and Aedwalker. And it's like Wolf and Aedwalker is like about sonnet length, and this poem is like 3 pages long. And Wolf and Aedwalker is a highly lyric, it's like a lyric poem in the voice of a woman from the year 800, as one of only like 2 or 3 things written in Old English in the voice of a woman, which you can tell from the grammar. And it's just a totally inscrutable lyric. And there are endless bad translations of it. And I made a translation of it, which essentially was notes of frustration after sitting at my desk for days trying to translate it. And it is done in this style where I attempt to hold open every possibility that exists within the poem without foreclosing it. And I did that after having been absolutely obsessed with reading the novelist Javier Marias, who writes in these extremely long sentences and does this thing where it's like, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. And like refuses to foreclose possibility. And so that's a poem that I like wrote that and I was like, oh shit, I was reading too much Javier Marias. And like I felt like that really helped me get that poem the way I wanted it. But I think like for the most part, I find myself to be more the relationship that I feel like I have with poets who are really important to me. And there's so many. I think the poems in this book, one thing that is different about it than my previous work is it's far more referential to other texts and artists and poems. And like there's ekphrastic poetry, there's like a lot of interaction. And so I would more say that like I'm in conversation with Paul Celan. And that's where the influence is, rather than that like my poems do anything in terms of voice or form or like anything, the line, like I don't know that I see his work in my work, except that I'm quoting it in my work and talking about it. But like, oh my God, if I could write a poem like Paul Celan, I would empty my bank account to do that. You know what I mean? Like he's incredible. But yeah, I don't think influence quite shows up. It's more interactive, I think, for me.
Yeah. I've become incredibly interested in Paul Celan and also reading him in German and French, which I don't really read French, kind of fake it. And I've been interested since your first book and the way translation plays in your work. We both took a translation class together. And that class was how I realized I was obsessed and highly influenced with Latin American poetry and with Eastern European poetry. But how, in this book, it's a lot less obvious than your first collection, because you're not like, you're not working with Old English, for example.
Yeah.
But do you find any of those skills that you have picked up from translation? Obviously, you went on to do a lot more of it after we studied it. I mean, you get a PhD in English focusing on Anglo-Saxon literature. It's like not that's like an all translation all this times kind of deal. How do you find that translation actually affects your poetry, and particularly when it comes to stuff like having a dialogue with a dead poet from 100 years ago who wrote in languages that you don't like speak as your native one?
Yeah, so much. I feel like the work that I did, reading translation theory and especially reading queer theory, as pertains to temporality.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote my dissertation, which basically is the Unstill Ones, includes a scholarly preface, which is not available for anyone to read, I don't think, or at least it's like still embargoed. But I never published anything from it, and I thought about, turning it into a monograph, but I don't. My time is limited, especially as a parent, and I don't feel as drawn towards the scholarly projects. Like, if I have time, I'm gonna spend it writing poems, or drafting, or like researching stuff for poems. But the scholarly preface that I wrote was really about the way that I used queer theory, and particular like temporality theory within queer theory, in conjunction with translation theory as a translator of Old English, and thinking about like queer time and time travel and communication in these ways. And the ways that that influenced me, which it did a lot. And I feel like it really changed my approach towards writing, and reading. And I think, so what I did in Impossible Things is, this was actually a very late change. I interspersed passages from my father's unpublished memoir with my own poems, and they kind of speak back and forth to each other, as you'll see if you read the book. And at first, what I did was, like, the only editing that I did was just in choosing those passages. And I really just carefully chose the ones that I thought of his were the best written, because I didn't write this book to be an asshole to my dad, even though sometimes I'm really pissed at him still, and that comes through in the book. But like, at first, I was just editing via extraction, and pretty late in the process, I just didn't feel it was working. I didn't feel the passages were compressed enough, were strong enough, and so I started turning them into erasure poems, and that was just enormously helpful. And I thought of it as an act of translation. I thought of it as translating my father into something that my father's writing into something that I could understand. And that spoke to me, and that spoke to my work. But I also thought of it as compressing what he had written to come closer and closer to revealing, if I could, like, his emotional truth. And so I didn't think of it as changing what he was doing. Often erasure is an act of violence. I think most erasure projects, and most of the best ones, are made by people erasing texts that are violent as an act of resistance, and, rebellion, and response. And this was not that. This was really an attempt to translate his text into poetry, and into a more emotional clarity than I think he had when he was working on it. But he didn't have the chance to revise. And my father loved poetry. And in fact, there's a lot of poetry in his book. He often starts a chapter with a poem, someone else's poem, thankfully.
One of the things, and I mean this is a compliment, but I remember back in our MFA days, and again, this is the advantage of an interviewer who has personal access to our experiences together. we were both highly theoretically informed poets, and you bring this up, like, I was very informed at the time by Baudrillardian concerns and stuff like that. But I remember one of the poets and teachers at our school, they often disagreed with Martin Lamon, but he told me once, like, you should read all that theory and it should inform your poetry, but I should not know that theory is there when you read your poetry.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say, like, outside of the one direct quote of Gender Trouble, um, um, um,
Yeah.
this book has that advantage. It feels very, like, because I know you, I do know that it's very theoretically informed, but I could read it and not know that at all.
Yeah.
How do you bring queer theory in? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about the way it functions with translation, and actually that's something I have thought about a lot. Some of the best texts on translation I've gotten from the queer bookstore, seriously, because they are related.
Yeah.
But what kind of theory went into this book specifically? Like, are there any theorist, and then how did you hide it? you know
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I certainly didn't try to hide anything. And I do think I couldn't disagree more with what Marty said to you in that moment. And I don't know whether he would still agree with himself or not, but he might not. But I think, to me, what makes the best translation is an honest one.
Mhm.
And I think what infuriates me about translation is the way that it can be used as an act of erasure. I started working as an Old English translator because I became enraged when I realized the way that people were translating poems that had been damaged. And in the Exeter book, which is a book there's one copy of, okay? Just one, that contains, 75% of Old English poetry. And there's one copy of it, and someone who had it at some point laid a hot poker down on it. And so it has these burned sections all throughout it. And the book was opened when the hot poker was laid on it. So it has this like kind of beautiful butterfly like pattern. How drunk you have to be to set down a hot poker on the Exeter book, I can only imagine. That's the only way I can like begin to forgive. But there's this poem in the Exeter book called The Ruin, which is a poem in the voice of someone. This was probably written, around between 800 and 900-ish. The person discovers the ruins of a city that are more advanced than anything they can imagine. They're seeing the ruins of a Roman city from like 1,000 years before. And this is not an experience we have, right? Like the closest thing we have is like when you go see a movie about aliens and you find there's like tech in a cave, right? Like that is from 75 years ago, but it's like tech beyond our wildest dreams. Like, but we don't actually have those experiences. So this poet is just describing this ruin, and they're unbelievably impressed by it. They're like, how could the people who made this have allowed it to become a ruin? Like, what could have happened? And they're just describing it. And this poem is damaged in multiple places by the hot poker. And so there are all of these gaps in it where the poem has been burned, and it's about a city being burned, right? And so there's these sections that are just missing. And because Old English poetry is highly formal, you can tell to a breath, right, exactly how much is missing in which space, which is cool. And I had read a couple translations of this poem. It was the poem that made me want to read Old English. It's just so like unbelievably gorgeous and moving. And then I looked at it in Old English and I saw how much was missing. And then I looked back at the translations and how they covered up that these chunks are missing. They just elide this damage so that you can't see it. And as a trans person, I like lost my mind. I was like, oh, you think this thing is damaged, and so you're going to put on another suit of clothing on it to make you feel comfortable. And so the translations, which I had previously been impressed by, I was enraged by. And so that's when I started. And I think, when I translate a text, I'm very careful to say this is a totally literal translation as best as I could do, or a literal translation wasn't possible here, so I went in another direction. But being clear about those things. And I think that's why I disagree with Marty. It's not about hiding your work. And in fact, a lot of times it's about showing it. Like showing those bones, which are amazing. And I think how much closer, we can be to each other and to texts, and to everything that's good and beautiful in this world, is by looking at as close as possible to being able to see the other, to being able to see what is. And if we don't understand it, to be able to be like, oh, I don't understand this, but I'm not going to fill it up with something that I do understand, because that changes it and that objectifies it. And so I think that was something I really learned through my process with Old English, and that continues to like bear on my work, and I think theoretically. So yeah, I mean, I like there's a double epigraph at the beginning of the book. There's a quote, and one of the quotes is from this amazing drag performer whose name is Vaginal Cream Davis. And that quote is, and actually the first quote above it is from that portion that Alice read to us from Journal of My Other Self. So it's Rilke, and then it's this quote from a drag performer, Vaginal Cream Davis, who says, I've always felt sorry for those with only one limited way of viewing their past. She claims to have been conceived under a table at a Ray Charles concert, which may or may not be true. But in any case, I think that like that she, I don't know if you know like this whole story, Derick, but she was essentially the like muse of one of the most important queer theorists of our time, Jose Munoz, who sadly died too young and wrote about queer futurity and possibility and queer utopia. Jose Munoz was obsessed with this artist, this drag performer and artist, and wrote about her extensively. And so I think like those are the ways that, I think theory like undergirds the collection. And, sometimes I notice things that are referential that probably only I'm seeing, and that's okay. But I also like never tried to hide anything.
I appreciate that. I actually think I'm thinking about a debate I have in my head going back 20 years about translation, because we were taught one school. I remember being taught like the poetry translation philosophy of like Coleman Bartz and Robert Bly, where you don't even necessarily speak the language. And I remember being frankly pissed.
Yeah.
And I was given an exercise, and I believe you were in this class, where we were asked to translate a poem from a language we don't know.
Yeah.
And I chose Romanian because it's close to Spanish, a language I do have a working understanding of, and tried to work from there. But I now am sort of frustrated by that idea that every translation is an act of creation. I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't give us the license to just make the past say whatever the hell I want it to.
No, and it's a colonial impulse, right? Like, like it's not just like, oh, we're doing art. And I remember that exercise, and it's like a sort of fun creative writing exercise. Like I think I chose Greek, and I don't read that alphabet. You know what I mean? So I chose something that I really knew, and it's funny because I actually do understand some Greek because I grew up with my uncle who's Greek, and so I can like pick out words, but like I don't know that alphabet. So I like was like, this is a joke. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's about it's like a theater exercise, right? Where we're all gonna go, oh, whoa, 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 and like try to loosen up. Um, but as a practice, it's like sort of politically bankrupt, I would say.
I would say it's politically bankrupt and scholarly problematic at
Yeah.
minimum.
Minimum.
Uh,
Absolutely. Like, yeah.
uh,
Um,
yeah, I mean, I just think about Coleman Bartz and Rumi, and I don't, I've met Coleman Bartz, but I just remember thinking like, you are the representation of Rumi to millions of Americans, and yet, how much Persian is reflected in this? So the cultural references are stripped out. Like, um, it makes it far more, you know, it reads a lot more like I don't know, generic like new age poetry than it should. And this actually does make me angry now, and it didn't when I was in college, but it does now because I'm just like, so I don't really have access to Rumi. I have access to Coleman Bart's Rumi, which is a
yes.
creation kind of, um, and not that I would have pure unadulterated real access to Rumi unless I spoke like, I don't know, whatever century Persian, and that specific dialect. But I do think we can approximate it and try to get there and make the strangeness remain, and not, you know, yeah. I'm okay with footnote, to explain a historical context. I don't know. I just don't have a problem with it. Um, and maybe having people who are, more conversant in modern or Persian give influence into this. The other thing I remember about that translation class when we learned from the Robert Bly School, and I don't mind slagging Robert Bly directly, so I'll just be clear about this one, was like the use of literal translators and not really crediting them.
Mm-hmm.
So you would find a native speaker who would give you a word for word like translinear translation, which would be a grammatical in English, and like I wouldn't want to publish that either. But like then the poet would come in and fix it as if the poet's magic poetness would make this readable, and then often like the fact that the literal translinear translation was done by usually a scholar from that region or country, they will probably get a thanks in the book, but it's probably not acknowledged that they're the people who did the actual language translation. And this practice set me afire even then. I was just like, wait, what? Like, I mean, that's so colonial. It's not even funny, and not just in the history of colonial way. Like, it's actively still perpetuating it. So,
Yeah.
like,
Absolutely. Exactly. And I think it's called a crib sheet
mm-hmm.
when they do that. That's what we always called it. When I was like sort of medieval studies adjacent. Like that's how most medieval translations are made. The translation of the ruin that I'm talking about was in a book where everything was done that way. And so yeah, a medievalist like wrote down a word for word translation and gives it to a poet who doesn't know Old English. And like the translation in that book of that poem, who I am not here to slag, was Yusuf Komanyaka, who's a
Oh
poet
yeah,
who I
we both love. Yeah.
respect all day long. And what he made was beautiful, but he didn't have access to the language at all. And, so much of poetry is sound and rhythm. And you have to know, And like, there's a translation that I have in the Unstill Ones of a different poem that I have a note at the end of the book that just includes the Old English for this like 2 lines. Cause I was just like, I couldn't approximate the sound. And it's gorgeous in Old English. It's absolutely gorgeous, and I couldn't make it work so that it sounded even close, right? And it just bothered me so much. But it should, right? It should bother us. And yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about oh, who's the scholar that I'm thinking of? It'll come to me, but I'm thinking of an article, that a translation studies article that I read that was like really really important. This is gonna bother me. Wait, I'm gonna look it up.
Okay.
But you ask me anything.
Why are you looking that up? I was. It's funny. I wasn't expecting us to talk so much about translation here, but I do think it's vital. And I wanted to mention something that when you first, and it was you who got me thinking about this. You had me read Anne Carson's translation of Sappho, and I thought I loved Sappho, and I did not realize from the translations of Sappho that I had gotten prior to the Anne Carson one how much of it was fixed. Like that like half those poems are fragments, and we get the fragment, and they tell you it's a fragment, but you can't tell from the poetry translation where the missing stuff is. And when you gave me that Anne Carson book, she actually makes sure you know this is gone, this is gone, this is gone, this is gone. Like, yes. And that was a wild experience to me. And that now it seems so basic, but like it was a revelation, because I was like, I actually appreciate knowing that there's a gap here, and I appreciate what that does poetically, but I also appreciate what that does is just me knowing that I don't really totally understand this poem. Like,
yeah, totally. And like, she does a really good job of that, right? And she does a variety of kinds of translation. And sometimes you pick up a book of hers and it like just is a very scholarly translation from ancient Greek.
Yep.
And sometimes it's some made up crazy shit. Like,
absolutely.
And you don't know what it's going to be, but you do know that whatever it is, she's going to tell you, right? And like, she's done the work.
Yeah, I don't mind the made up crazy shit translation when I'm told it's a made up crazy shit translation. Like, I do not mind when someone's like, this is an adaptation, because then I know, like, you're running with it. Like, I know that, like, you're going nuts. I'm not reading this to get the original, like with a poet that's unfortunately hyper influential on me, but I like to refer to as the old fascist, because he was, is Ezra Pound. And I remember realizing what the hell he did to Chinese poetry. Yeah. And unfortunately for me, for a long time, a lot of Poundian translations, which do not admit that he didn't really understand, medieval Mandarin, and that some of his translations are really just glosses. They have none of the form, and some of the contents filled in, etc. And I don't mind that if you tell me, right? Like, because we can definitely, you're right, Anne Carson does that all the time, but she does tell you, like, when she's like, I don't know, she got an Oedipus play and just went like buck wild with it, versus when she's giving you something as close to the original as she can do.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I find it interesting, because this seems to be a theme in your work in particular, going back as long as I've known you. Like, this tension between translation and knowability, and trying to both communicate these things, but also make it known there's parts of it you can't. And I think it's interesting how much it affects your actual poetry, like, not just your translation work.
Yeah, I mean, I think because it just all is a translation. And I think, at the risk of words starting to lose their meaning to say that, but communication is really hard. and words are already metaphors, right? Like if we think about like sign, signifier, signified type stuff, like words are already not complete, like they're gestural. And I think I'm hyper aware of that, of the fallibility of language itself. And at the same time, I consider myself a like fairly non-experimental poet, a very literal, like I feel like a fairly hyper literal like approach most of the time. Hey, I'm going to tell you a story, you know. This thing happened and here's what it felt like and here's what I thought about, or things like that. And I I don't usually embrace the surreal that much. I'm like quite focused in some ways on describing the world as I see it. And it's funny, there's a moment in my book where I actually removed the poet's name who said this thing to me in the poem, but it was Marie Howe. And Marie, when I took a class with her as an undergraduate, which I didn't get into, and it was like my last chance to take a class with her. She had been on leave, and then I just didn't get into the class. And I had a very sad miniature sit-in of one in the president's office. And I was just like, I'm really sorry, but I'm not going to leave you alone until you let me take this class. Like, it's not happening. And Marie agreed to let me take the class as like one over the limit. And the president then agreed, since Marie had. But Marie forbid us from using any expository writing basically for the semester. She was like, just describe. You don't have to do anything other than describe the world that you see and experience around you to make meaning. You're not capable of not making meaning. And so practice just describing before you go on to say what you think or how you feel or anything like that. And we were all like, that's not possible. you know. But we did it, and it's something that I still come back to. In sort of the same way that I think often about that little forward at the beginning of Anna Akhmatova's poem Requiem, where she says, where she's going to stand in front of a prison every day, right, in Stalingrad, and with like thousands of other people whose families are prisoners. And there's just this little foreword before the poem that says, I went to stand outside the prison every day. And then a lady recognized me and said, are you the poet? Are you Akhmatova? And I said, yes. And she said, can you describe this? And I said, yes, And then there's like a beautiful untranslatable line, I think, that says something like a smile passed over what had once been her face, type thing. And it's just like, I really think it's very, in some ways it's very old fashioned, but I think that's the poet's job, to describe this and to keep practicing describing things so that when you really need to, you have those tools. And that's why it's not a totally navel gazing endeavor, right? Like, at all. It's really important. And because we all know, whether or not we are artists, how good it feels to hear a song or see a painting or read a poem that describes a thing you felt and never experienced described before.
Mm-hmm.
And how meaningful that is as a part of life. But yeah, I think so. Like, on one hand, I feel totally aware that language is inadequate, like completely inadequate. And then on the other hand, I'm like, I'm still using it to try my best to describe like what I can.
On that note, I know you have to go, and I want to plug your book, Impossible Things, Duke University Press. But I actually want to give you a compliment, and something I've never told you. it was working with you and Alice Fryman. You remember, maybe you do, my love of language poetry and the playing with the idea that language isn't sufficient all the time, which I still do. But it was you and Alice, and I specifically you and Alice, who, because you loved a lot of those same poets as me, and yet you would write these highly descriptive, deceptively plain, like they were very deceptively plain, and I realized that as we worked together, poems, often about just observations. And I often attribute you and Alice for me being willing to touch narrative at all, or do anything, comprehensible. And it was that impulse that you have to just be like, we can understand the weird, we can know the limitations of language. We didn't even call that out, but we are going to try to be descriptive, or at least give enough narrative and description for someone to be able to invest in it. And I really do think the two of you really gave me the freedom to do that. Whereas beforehand, I was rebelling against, the Donald Hall school of poetry, that 70s, like male confessional mode. And it was nice for someone to be like, no, you don't have to make every poem unreadable.
Yeah.
To like get to some semiotic point that you're trying to make.
You were like the Alex P. Keaton of poets.
Yeah, that was.
But like, yeah, I think that I mean, honestly, thank God that show was made. It's so helpful as a reference point. Thank you, Family Ties. But like, I think you're right. You're right to rebel against that.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I'm trying not to quote T.S. Eliot right now. Like from, in Tradition and the Individual Talent, when he's like having a fake argument with an unknown young poet who's like, why do we have to read the poets that came before? We know so much more than they do. And he's like, yes, of course you know more than they do because you know everything that they knew because they wrote it down. Like, yeah. So like, you're standing on the shoulders of giants type thing. And like, I really have a lot of appreciation for some of that type of poetry. And at the same time, like, I think, a poet whose work meant a lot to me and who I learned a lot from as an undergrad was Thomas Lux. And one of the things that I learned from him, and this sort of gets to maybe like a question that you asked me earlier about like my own work's progression, but like as a young person, I had a lot of ideas about what poetry was supposed to be like, either copying what other people were doing or saying that I should do, or in rebellion against it. Like, oh, this person says you have to do this, so you should definitely never do this, right? Or you have to do this for that. And so my head was really full about like what poems should look like, what topics they could address, like how much pain there needed to be in them, like, all pain needed to be in them. And Tom was like really taught me that you get to be your whole self on the page. And like he really helped me to bring my sense of humor to the page, which there's actually, I think, a surprising amount of humor in Impossible Things, even though it's like a very dark book. There's like a lot of humor in it, I think, and that really like, I think that's like related to the story that you're telling about me and Alice. Like, you don't have to cut anything out or just be reactive to this or that. Like, and those impulses, as a teacher now myself, I would say to you, if you were my student, I would be like, the impulses that you're having are very important to listen to. The fact that you're rebelling against all of this bullshit says everything good about you and the future of your work. And it can't only be reactive that way. You have to do other stuff too. And like listen to your gut and follow it, but also like you don't have to only be doing that one thing. And you can be your whole self on the page. And I think that is something that I have embraced, you know, as time has gone on. And like, you know, in Impossible Things, it's the first book that I worked on completely outside of any classroom experience. Like I was not in a workshop. Nobody was looking at the poems. Nobody was giving me feedback, nothing. And I think in some places, like I gave myself a lot more string, rope or whatever than usually I would have. Cause I was like, there's nobody here to be like, Miller, you're this kind of a poet. You don't do this, you know? Marty told me not to write sonnets. He told me that I was a free verse poet. Like, and in a way I'm grateful because it caused me to be like, go harder at form.
Yeah. For people who don't know, Martin Lamon is sort of he's a friend of mine now, but he was sort of a bête noir back in the odds.
Well, one thing I'll say about Marty Lamon, and you know, Marty, if you're listening, this is like from the heart. Like I think I don't know that I've experienced a better line editor than Marty Lamon. I mean, unbelievable. Like if you have a poem that's close, he would just take it and show you exactly how to cut what you needed to cut and to like shift a line break to get every ounce of power out of something. And I learned so much from that. And I will never be as good of a line editor as he is. Like he has such a gift for it. But like I think that desire to edit actually sometimes like came through in ways that were less helpful.
Yeah. We'll end on that note, on a positive note. I really do think people should pick up this book. If you're not, half of my audience, well, about a third of my audience is interested in the arts, and the other, my audience is interested in theory and politics. But I think if you're intimidated by poetry, despite the fact that this is formally complicated, this is not an intimidating book. And I mean that as a compliment, because I do actually think it's a complicated book, both emotionally, textually, content, and formally. But I think a reader doesn't have to. I think you can actually read this without that knowledge and have an awakened interest in that knowledge for you. And that's one of the best things I can say about a book of poetry. So thanks, Miller.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I wanted it to be accessible in that way. And like, you know, that's one of the reasons why the book actually begins and ends with 2 short essays, which probably shocked you, Derick. You were like,
it did actually. I was like, wait, there's an essay here. There's an epilogue. There's a whole epilogue.
Yeah. So it definitely like, you know, there's a lot of storytelling. Yeah, I think that, you know, if you're a person who, I'll just say this, like maybe in closing too, my father, the book that he was writing, the memoir that he was working on before he died, which was very bad. I should say, and he knew it, but he didn't have time to work on it. The book he was writing before he died, his purpose in writing that book, was to say to other people who had lost a child, you are not alone. And people who had experienced like really serious grief and guilt. When his son died in 1972, there was not a counseling group or like, you know, anything. He was just totally isolated with this guilt and grief and shame. And he describes things in the book like people crossing the street to avoid him after his child died because of like either superstition that it would like rub off or just because they couldn't possibly handle speaking to someone who is in that much pain. And he wanted to write the book to like create community and say to people like, I experienced this, and like this is honestly normal, you know. And I like to think that in some way my book finishes in a really different way than he would have, the project he was trying to do. And so if you're a person who's like processing family grief and generational trauma of any kind, like, you know, I think it might interest you, whether or not you like poems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Miller, where can people find your work in addition to this book?
I have a website, and which is probably, let me just start typing, is probably MillerOberman.com. What is my website? It's MillerWolfOberman.com. And you can also find my work up at like a variety of spots. Certainly a lot of poems from this book were in Poetry Magazine, as along with other places. But yeah, you can find links to my work on my website. And you can follow me on vile social media platforms like Instagram, that are not fun anymore, but where some of us still go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say Instagram and TikTok are two of the lesserly vile ones too. That's the sad thing.
It's true. I don't
All right.
I don't TikTok, but I am sort of still on Instagram. But yeah, if you're interested in my work, go to my website. There's a lot of links to poems, you know, and you can find my book at Duke University Press, or you know, anywhere, you know, that sells books usually. So I can't recommend the site that starts with the letter A.
Of course. Yeah. But Powell's, you go to Powell's is safe, right? Powell's hasn't like supported anything terrible lately.
No, Powell's is great. Powell's is great. And what's that other one? You know, the one that supports Bookshop. Bookshop.org.
Yeah, Bookshop. Yeah.
It's good too. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Derick. It's so nice to talk to you.
It's nice talking to you too. Bye-bye.